I'm Laura Austin, Adult Programming Librarian at the Saline County Library, and thank you for joining us for our rebooted edition of SCL Quilts 2020. Jennifer Watson and I started this in January as a Block of the Month club. However, things did not work out as planned, and so we had to stop doing it. So we decided that instead of doing the live classes like we had planned, that we would do online tutorials with all of the blocks that we had intended to do for the entire year. So now instead of a Block of the Month club, it's more of a 2 Block of the Month club. And so this is a new challenge that's going to have, it's self-paced, it's got video tutorials on how to do each one of the blocks. By the time that you are done with all of the blocks, you should have all of the skills to feel really confident to make any kind of quilt that you want. Each one of the blocks builds on another one, and so you have to finish one to open up the other, and you will progressively get a little more complicated until you get into working with circles and things like that, which are usually very challenging for people. And so we will go all the way through all of these, and at the end of it, if you complete the challenge, then you will have at the very minimum a 3-foot by 4-foot quilt that you can, or at least a quilt top that you can have quilted, or we'll talk about different ways that you can take care of it to create an actual quilt out of it by next year. And so thank you for joining us. And if you do have questions, you can always email me. My email address is laura@salinecountylibrary.org. You always have access to Creative Bug, and so if you do have just questions on minor things like how to sew a seam, things like that, hopefully we will cover all of that stuff, but you can also check on Creative Bug and see if there's a different tutorial, because sometimes all you need is just a different perspective on things. And so I'm hoping to cover everything in a very thorough manner, and so you should be able to complete everything. But please, if you do have questions, let me know. We will also have a Facebook group set up just for those who are participating, and so you can go there and just talk with other participants, show off your works, things like that. It should be a whole lot of fun. And so I hope you stick with it for the next 6 months or so, and at the end you feel like you have learned and accomplished something. Before we actually get into starting our blocks, we need to talk about the setup that you'll want to have all of your stuff in. So the first thing that you're going to want is a sewing machine, and this is the one that I have. It does not need to be anything fancy. It can be from 1960. I do have my 1961 that is awesome, and I love it in another cabinet. You don't need to spend a lot of money on this. It just has to do a straight stitch. And so this is the one that I have, and I'll be using. I do have different feet that I like to use for it. The one that I would suggest if you're going to go out and buy anything is just called a 1/4 inch piecing foot. And what that has is just, it looks like a regular presser foot, but it has just this little tab on the side that you can just push your fabric right up next to, and you know you're always getting a 1/4 inch seam. And so that one, it's a luxury. You don't have to have it, but if you are going to spend any money, I would say that's probably one of your best purchases. The other thing that you might want to look into is called a walking foot, and it looks really scary, but what it does is as your feed dogs grab the fabric on the bottom side, this grabs your fabric on the top side. So especially when you start doing triangles, things like that, that start working on the bias, this helps you keep from stretching or getting off center on your fabric, so you don't have little pieces hanging over on one side or the other. So those are the only 2 purchases that you may want to consider. Otherwise, as long as you have a straight stitch, you are perfectly fine. And also, if you don't want to buy a sewing machine at all and you don't have one, you can do all of this by hand. It's just going to take a lot longer, but you can do it. So you'll want sewing machine, you'll want some sort of pins. I have some little clips here. Those are definitely a luxury, but you know, if you're going to spend a little money, that's something that you might want to look into. A nice pair of scissors, and these are my utility scissors because they've got a little round tip to them, and they're nice for clipping threads. But if you're going to just have one pair of scissors, you want it to be something that has a really sharp tip to it and has a pretty good long blade on it. It does not have to be anything fancy. Again, as long as it cuts fabric, it'll work. You will want to have some form of a seam ripper, because there will be times where you need to rip out the seams, and you should never ever feel bad or feel like you are a terrible quilter when you have to rip something out, because things just go wrong. And so you need to just learn to love the seam ripper, because it will save a lot of heartache in the end. And so those are the main things you'll want around your sewing area. So your sewing machine, some pins, a pair of scissors, and your seam ripper. Then if you were going to work with a rotary system at all, scissors are perfectly fine, that's all you need. But if you do want to have a rotary cutter, the absolute minimum that you have to have is a mat. And I would suggest, if you're only going to have one mat, at least have one that's 2 foot by 3 foot. And so this will get you through pretty much anything you're ever going to come up against, and it should last a good long time. So you definitely have to have a mat, and you definitely need a rotary cutter. And if, again, you're going to just get one, I would get at least a 45 millimeter. They have smaller ones, they have larger ones. It's really just whatever you want to have, but a 45 is a good medium to always do anything that you need. And there are a million rulers out there. You don't need all of those. You're going to really feel like you have to go out and get all of these specialty rulers, but you don't need them. I honestly only have 2. And so these are the ones that I actually go and use all the time. If you're only going to get one that's a long one, that's at least a 24 inch. And this one is an 8.5. I think they come in like 6 or maybe a 10, something like that. But a good 6 by 24 or 8.5 by 24, this will get you pretty much anything that you're going to need with your quilting. If you do want to get luxury items, the only other ruler that I really use is this 12.5 inch square. And this will actually come in really handy for this class, because we have built our blocks to be 12.5 inches. And so there will be times where you get a little bit off on the edges and they don't look quite right, and you need to square up your piece. And this will help you square up anything. And so this one is extra super handy, but again, not necessary. And then the last thing that is an extra super luxury, and I would never ever buy this unless you have a really good coupon. This is a rotary turntable. And so it's a mat that you can actually spin. And so this is really nice, just because, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of quilting blocks that you need to square up, you can just put it on here, place your ruler, make your cut, turn it, make the other cut, and you never actually have to pick up your piece. So again, do not buy this unless you have a really good coupon, because these are expensive and they're not as handy as you think they are. They're nice. I do like it. However, you can also do the same thing by just getting a smaller mat and laying on top of your large one. And then you can just spin the small mat on top of the large one, because it'll slide a little bit better on there. So that is your rotary set. You're always going to want to have good lighting, because especially with a lot of these, those lines are really little. And sometimes the fabric kind of makes them blend in a little bit. A lot of them will have this bright yellow that'll help kind of accentuate everything, but it does kind of become hard to see sometimes, so you don't want to have to squint constantly. So you're going to want some really good lighting. And then the last thing that you need is an ironing station, because the absolute most common thing that you are doing aside from sewing things together is pressing them down. because you need to have all of your seams pressed flat and even so that you can join your pieces and have them match up like they're supposed to. Now you can just use a regular ironing board. It totally works fine. This is an old iron of mine. I really like it because it's heavy, which sounds like a horrible thing to have in an iron, but it's actually really nice because I don't have to do all the pressing. And so I can just lay it down, go over my seam, and I don't have to keep pressing it back and forth. A lot of people will use travel irons, which are fine, but you will find yourself having to go back and forth over it several times. I do suggest it have steam and that you keep it on the steam setting for most of the time because you're going to be working with 100% cotton, and so you're not going to scorch it with the steam setting, but that steam will actually help your stitches to ease into one another and lose some of their tension and really help and set that seam together really nice. So you can do that. This is a board that I actually built myself, and I would suggest if you do have the random pieces of wood like we have in our garage that you create one, because this is flatter and sturdier than a lot of the ironing boards that you're going to find, and you can make it as big as you want it, and typically I say the bigger the better. I probably would have made this a little bit bigger, but this is just a scrap piece that I had out in the garage and I didn't have to do anything to it, and so I just grabbed it. It's just some plywood. I bought this stuff at, I don't know, one of the craft stores. You can find it pretty much anywhere. You have to look for it a little bit, but it's just ironing board cover, and it's sort of a metallic stuff that's quilted with some batting in there, and then just staple it down with a heavy duty stapler, and that won't scoot. I have a good large area to be able to press my blocks, and it's really good and firm, and I don't have much wiggle to it. So those are the main things that you're going to want to have set up in your area. You do not need your entire room set up to be a craft room, as I do. I just happen to be that kind of person. But you do need a good large space. So generally, if you can take over a whole table in the dining room, something like that, that will really give you enough room to be able to work around it. And so just think about your workflow as you're setting up your sewing machine and everything, so that you can kind of make it to where you don't have to get up constantly to move from one place to another. Because especially between the sewing machine and your ironing board, you're going to be constantly finishing a seam, pressing it down, going back, putting something else on there, pressing it down. And so usually you want those pretty close to one another. I just happen to have a space that this works better for me in the way that it's set up. So again, if you do have questions, just let us know. My email address is laura@salincountylibrary.org. So let's get started.